So a big classification scheme that we use in social sciences and the research we do is differentiating quantitative and qualitative methods. So quantitative methods, and you probably can understand this distinction just by the terms that are used, but quantitative, this is the number side of research. So these are things that can be measured easily, on a scale to 1 to 5, give me a number. So these are things that can be measured in those ratio and interval scales that we talked about last week. So easy to quantify: body weight, height, temperature, a lot of the things that are measured with different kinds of tools that are replicable, very easy. So this really focuses on things that can be captured in numbers and quantified. Usually quantitative approaches rely on statistics, and statistics by necessity require large samples. So usually quantitative methods have sample sizes of maybe anything 200 to actually millions. Big data analysis now that goes on with stuff like Facebook and social network data, there's probably like a billion data point data sets that exist now that are used for like mining big data and that kind of thing. So large samples can be really large, and they can actually be quite small. So anything, with statistical properties, anything that's taken from a simple random sample with 30 or above actually has a lot of statistical qualities of anything that would be above that. So you could take a random sample of 30 people and extrapolate those results to hundreds of thousands of individuals in terms of the statistical properties behind that. So the size of the sample is varying, but it needs to be more than a few, I think, is a good way to think about it. Like I said, everything is put into numbers. So if we wanted to do a quantitative analysis of race and ethnicity, we would I would ask individuals what their race and ethnicity was, and then I would assign numbers to that, and then I would maybe look at percentage of people that are obese in the different racial ethnic categories and do an analysis like that. So what I would use is statistical analysis to make to really get a sense of what's going on in the data, to understand the data, and then to report on that. So a lot of what you'll probably be finding for your research, especially people in nutrition, is going to be quantitative stuff, because this is where people, you take a survey of people, ask them either about their nutrition quality, about their response to maybe marketing campaigns, and then you quantify it. And it's a big, well, I shouldn't say it's big, but in sociology there's this concept of quantification of culture, and I'm sure that even in your lifetimes you've seen this shift from things being more subjective, not measured, not quantified, to everything being quantified. Everything's focused on a value of either money, time, body weight, just everything. We use numbers to understand our lives more and more. So that's called the quantification of culture. So on this one extreme, we have everything being measured, almost an economic perspective of everything can be measured, and we understand the measurement of it, and that's how we respond to it. On the other side, we have the qualitative approach. So this is, I guess you have on one side rationality, quantification, and on the other side you have emotion and qualitative approaches. Now, if somebody was a qualitative researcher and heard me say that, they may strike me down for it, because we all think, oh, rational is better than emotional. It's not necessarily the case, and a lot of times even qualitative approaches get mixed with quantitative, so there's really not these two ideal types. That I like to describe a lot of things using that kind of concept of two bipolar opposites, or polar opposites. So qualitative approaches, this is looking at behavior and trying to make sense of what's going on in social settings with individuals, usually through observation. So it takes a lot of time and energy for people to do this, because instead of just asking everybody on a survey, how depressed are you, I would have to monitor your behavior for a long enough time for me to be able to say, are you depressed or not, and make that assumption myself, make that judgment. So that becomes really time consuming. This necessitates small groups and limited settings. So in a survey, you can just call everybody at home. It's super easy. Get them to respond to questions. Hopefully they're honest. And you can do the analysis. With this, you have to observe people. So it has to be in kind of narrow parameters, narrow settings around it, or else the scope just gets too big to handle. When we use qualitative approaches instead of, in the end, talking about descriptive statistics or regression, so this predicted this is the correlation between these two things. The results section of a qualitative paper would include a lot of quotes, maybe include a lot of either pictures, if that was part of the hypothesis. So I like to think of qualitative and this like naturalistic observation. I think a real good way to think about it is somebody's studying animals in like the savannah or something using a pair of binoculars, So only where that pair of binoculars is focused is what's being observed. And let's say that this is back 200-300 years ago, before that sort of like animal observation studies were done a lot. So there's not a lot of theory about how animals interact. So you're just sitting there watching these animals trying to come up with an idea about why they interact the way that they do. So that becomes, it's really something difficult to do if you don't have any preconceived notions of that. So what you would do is sit there in the bush for days on end and watch these rhinoceroses or whatever you're interested in interact and play and maybe fight and that kind of thing. And then what you'd have to do is, after you collected enough data where you're not seeing kind of unique interaction going on, is you'd have to take all of that data and somehow put it together and interpret it. So you can imagine that would be really hard back then, because it's probably just from a ton of written notes, especially before cameras. But now we have tools like cameras, videos, that we can go through and review it over and over, and it makes it quite easy. We also have computer-based tools to actually, even with facial recognition and recognition of different kinds of shapes, you can actually use computers to help you draw some of these conclusions now. But really the idea is this is based on your opinion of what's going on. So these qualitative approaches are sort of how you feel about this and interpreting it through, I guess, not an emotional pathway, I shouldn't say that, but drawing your own conclusions about these things and trying it to relate to other stuff. So I've talked a lot about teen pregnancy. We talked about low birth weight, but I wanted to ask you guys and to see if you can, if you got this, what would be a quantitative approach to measuring teen pregnancy in the state of Texas, let's just say?
Numbers and results of statistics. Or are you talking about just the approach itself?
No, I mean, so you're definitely on that you would use numerical.
You're worried about the numbers rather than the actual behavior.
Right. So if you wanted to, I think that's pretty close. I was kind of thinking so if I wanted to look at just the rate of teen pregnancy in the state of Texas, what I would need to do is get the, birth data, I guess birth certificates for all babies that were born, and get the mother's information. And then I would be able to say what % of all births in the state of Texas in a given year were to teen mothers and something like that. So I would be using those numbers and statistics to make the conclusion. Now, what would be a qualitative approach to studying teen pregnancy?
Differences in race.
So that's getting, so how would you assess differences in race in concerns or in relationship to teen pregnancy using a qualitative approach? So a
Like giving the babies whatever race the mother is, and then
So I think the way that you're describing it is still falling. It could still be either of those. So we need more of a way to, let's say that we want to collect qualitative data. So actually think about the collection of the data.
Would it be more, rather than just worried about the statistics, it'd be worried about how they got to that point, as in like where region they live in, their age? I mean, it could have demographics into it with it, or
So that's it. You started off, I think, getting there more. So like how they got there, and you would want to take demographics and that kind of thing into consideration, but more it would be like just simply asking a teen mom, how did you get, like what decisions did you make in your life that led you towards either wanting to be a teen mom or that happening as a result of risky behavior or not planning and that kind of thing. So it would actually be, pretty much sitting down in a conversational kind of approach and saying, why, how does this affect your life? And maybe if we talk about low birth weight even more, we can look at what percent of births to teen moms were low birth weight births. But then in the qualitative, you could probably, maybe conceptualize it as you want to ask teen moms who had low birth weight infants how hard that's been on them, or have they seen, the impact of their infant being low birth weight on, I guess, the health of the child, on their own health, and that kind of thing. So I think the one distinction is that this qualitative stuff really digs deep into a single observation. So one observation really means a lot, where in quantitative research, one observation is only one small snapshot. You have to have a lot more of those snapshots. So, I think you guys have good responses to this. So qualitative approaches is what we're going to focus on for really the rest. Well, we kind of get into quantitative at the end of this chapter, but we really start with, I guess, one of the prototypical ways to conduct qualitative research, which is naturalistic observation. So this is the researcher in Mozambique watching how giraffes play on his binoculars. I actually just found a pair of binoculars in the street that are really nice. So I'm obsessed with binoculars right now. I'm like spying on my neighbors. I'm not doing that, but I was able to read license plates from really far away, so I felt like a PI. It's pretty cool. So naturalistic observation. I'm doing naturalistic observation on my neighbors with my new tools. So this is also called field work or field observation, and that's because it's done in the field. It's naturalistic because it's happening in the context and the surroundings that are natural to what you're studying. So if I was doing naturalistic observation, I'd want to be in the desert or the plains where these animals live, not in a laboratory, not in a zoo, because you wouldn't be getting a perspective of what they do in their natural environment. So this really has its roots in anthropology, where individuals would go and actually try to either observe and live on the outside of tribes and that kind of thing to get an understanding of how tribal peoples live and that kind of thing. So now ethnography it's really become more detailed, and an ethnographic type of research can be done on a small street gang. It can be done on social cliques and that kind of thing. So it's really gotten more narrow. The main point of this is, so these are observational studies that are done in a natural setting. So you're collecting that data, you're collecting that information, you're collecting those I guess opinions and observations in their natural setting. So this can be done for animals, and I think that's a good way to just conceptualize it. It makes a lot of sense. But we're animals, and so a lot of this is done in organizational settings. So I worked at I don't know if you've ever heard of this place, Nambe Design. When I was an undergraduate, I worked there. And we had a manager who was just, a little kooky. I didn't really think she was all that bad, but a lot of the other people really didn't like her, so there was a lot of just infighting and that kind of thing. And eventually they sent an organizational psychologist out to our store to observe us. And I think what happened was they actually ended up doing surveys with us and interviewed us and talked about, well, do you feel pressured by this, the general manager and that kind of thing. But I think what happened before that is they actually probably came in undercover and looked at how we were interacting with them when they were customers. So they were actually undercover doing this, making observations of us in our natural setting, which they were interested in, which was where we were working. So this is used a lot to see how people interact. And for the most part, I shouldn't even say for the most part, but a lot of this goes on undercover. So people are in disguise, people are deceived because they don't know that they're being observed. Now, with the binoculars, you can be being observed from 100 meters away and you would never know. But then there's people that go undercover and act like they're either just a normal person in everyday life, or in more advanced applications, I guess they would be, you might actually become a friend with this person and they might be under disguise and try to bring you in and try to acknowledge and get to know you in a more personal way. So it can be, it has ethical considerations to consider as well.
For the animal ones, like there was a lady who went and lived with gorillas. Was it a lady who was like, maybe in the 90s? And would that be considered naturalistic because she's not a gorilla? She obviously can't dress up like 100%. So is that disturbing their normal?
I think, and that's where we get to participant observation a little bit more. I would say that if she's interacting, she's influencing them, that she's only getting observations of those gorilla in response to her, not really in their natural environment without her. So I think she would be influencing that. And that's part of participant observation, and we'll talk a little bit more. So when you're doing this naturalistic style of observation, you're usually observing. That's the main point. You can also be interviewing individuals, surveying documents. And that is, I guess, kind of tertiary or secondary to the actual observation. So observation is really the main point with this naturalistic stuff. The goal of naturalistic observation is really to describe what's going on in a natural setting, really to describe your, I guess, research question and maybe your hypotheses as much as you can in a natural setting. So you want to describe the setting itself. So you want to describe the savanna where you're watching these people, or you want to describe the store that you're observing people in. You want to describe the events. So, how many times did these giraffes fight? How many times did they help, group hunt, or, I guess group hunt a tree, something like that. So actually what's going on with the individuals. And then describe the actual people themselves. So in the setting of my interior design store, they probably want to describe me, and they want to describe my coworker separately because we have different habits and styles of interaction and that kind of thing. So you want to get down and focus on the individual people themselves. Then you would take all of this information, and let's say we're looking at giraffes, and then you want to kind of categorize things. So today was a lazy day. Today was an active day. Today was like a feeding day. Today there was a lot of fighting. And you want to start putting all of your observations and just putting them into piles. So you would imagine that giraffes only have, a handful, not a whole lot of different ways that they interact. So you'd want to say, okay, the first one is that they're kissing each other. The second one is they're wrapping their necks around each other. The third one is that they're not looking at one another, and kind of start categorizing all of your observations and put them into these groups, so then you can better understand how things differ. What you'll have to do then, once you categorize everything, is based on your specialization, your knowledge of the field, is interpret that. So why do certain days their giraffes behave this way, and on the certain days they behave this way? So that organizational psychologist, why did the store employees act this way when the manager wasn't there, but they acted this way when the manager was there? Was it really the manager being psycho and, really mean, or was it like a natural thing? People act differently around authorities, especially when they're paying your, wage, that kind of thing. So you have to use your specialized knowledge to understand what occurred. What you'll then do is write up a report. If you're in the field observing giraffe, you'd write up a report of your giraffes, and if it was back 200 years ago, you'd write a long book about it, and you'd become famous, and you'd have a cool leather cap, and probably a gun with one of those big trumpet-looking things at the end, and you go down in history as the first naturalistic giraffe observer, where there's not a lot of groundbreaking stuff you can do these days, so you're just another person watching giraffes. Or as an organizational psychologist, you come up with your hypotheses and say, I really do think that the manager is overly authoritative. She's, punishes people for being late too harshly and that kind of thing. And then you'd write up the results, because at this point, nobody else can understand your observations and insights because you haven't summarized them. So you have to summarize all this, present your report, and then other people can make their judgments and make sense of it. There's a lot of problems with naturalistic observation, and the one you described is the difference between non-participant observation versus participant observation. So the safari guy, he's probably doing non-participant observation because he doesn't have a giraffe suit on. He's not out there rolling around with the giraffes. So he's observing from afar. That's not always true. So maybe he is good at making papier-mâché things, and he wants to see how giraffes act to, I don't know, a bunch of vultures, or just something that he would actually create and put in their environment and see how they react to that. So that would actually be kind of participating. So that kind of jumps the gap between non-participant and participant observation. Where participant observation is you're directly interacting with individuals. So in your example with the gorillas, I would say that this is participant observation because she was in there, scratching around with the gorillas, doing what gorillas do probably, and actually influencing how people respond to them. So I've talked about the Hunter S. Thompson Hell's Angels book already, and this is a good example of participant observation. So instead of just kind of shadowing them and looking at them through binoculars and reading media reports about the Hell's Angels and then coming up with something, he actually bought a motorcycle, or he had a motorcycle, and became part of the gang, and they never put him into the gang. He was never patched in. But they let him hang out, and I guess he was wild enough where he was doing the drinking and drugs and everything with them and collecting information on them that way. At that point, they didn't know that he was, going to write kind of a scathing review of the Hell's Angels. They just thought like, oh, this guy's cool. He's going to be into, whatever we're doing and maybe write about it, and hopefully he'll portray us in a good light. He ended up portraying them kind of in a negative light, and they really disliked him afterwards for it. But what happened with him being there was probably different than what happened without him being there. So it's hard to hypothesize without actually him being there and seeing what he saw. But maybe they were even more aggressive and more violent without another person there, or maybe they were less violent because they were just showing off and trying to be cool in front of somebody that they were going to get, written up by. So there's always that issue, and this also relates to behavior and reactivity. So we've talked about reactivity when a measure of something is changed by the actual measurement of it. So him being there could have changed what he was observing. So their behavior could have been reactive to him participating in their motorcycle gang. So he was pretty much unconcealed. He was there participating as himself. But you can imagine that this kind of concealment in the example of the organizational psychologist, they probably came in undercover and asked us, and just kind of lingered around, watched how we interacted with them. and tried to hide themselves. So they tried to conceal their identity from us. Another problem with naturalistic observation is that sometimes the setting changes very quickly. So it's easy in an experiment to say, I'm only observing this. I want to only observe blood pressure change related to my drug. Where when you're in a naturalistic setting, all of a sudden things can change very quickly, you know? So imagine you were doing naturalistic observation, I don't know, of even just like, I don't know, billiards and yeah, like billiards clubs or like bars before 9/11 in New York City and then right after. So if you're trying to talk about how people interact at these billiards clubs before, you know, pre 9/11 and post 9/11, it's probably completely different. So you have to be, if you're really participating and doing these observations, you have to be flexible to what would change over time. So what events would make changes to what you're observing. You know, imagine in the giraffe example, so if you have a bunch of giraffes and they're really happy and stuff, but then the drought starts to increase and a bunch of, I don't know, other animals start inhabiting that land. If you're not really interested in these other animals, you're probably pissed off because you're like, I want the giraffes. I came here for the giraffes. But now there's something going on, you know, an interaction between these giraffes and, I don't know, hyenas or something. So you really have to be flexible because in natural environments, things change quickly. You know, we say that change is the only constant in life. So you really have to be flexible. And what can happen is sometimes you don't actually observe what you went for. Sometimes this is good because you happened upon something completely new. Other times this is bad because maybe you're on a grant and you have to focus on the giraffes and the giraffes all left and then you only have hyena reports and then you get fired. So this can be kind of difficult. The strength of these kinds of studies is that they are able to describe really complex things that haven't been described before. And that's, I think, a point of these two is that they're not good for testing hypotheses. They're good for generating hypotheses. They're not good for testing ideas. They're good for generating them. So if I'm interested in, I don't know, the upper middle class motorcycle gangs of Austin that were out at Bike Week this week, and nobody's done any research on, you know, do these dentists and doctors act all crazy and wild when they put on a motorcycle vest or something like that. What I would want to go do is like go down there and do my, you know, probably non-participant observation and really dig in to see if that's something that occurs. Do these dentists, you know, start, I don't know, getting super drunk and partying and fighting just like any other motorcycle gang as soon as they're around other motorcyclists or something like that. So these are tools to come up with ideas, to study very complex, really hopefully pretty narrow kinds of situations and that kind of thing, but things that haven't been done before. So coming up with new ideas. There's a lot of limitations. It's very labor intensive. This is kind of like theory. So we talked about the difference between or the use of theory in developing ideas for research. This is kind of like theory itself. So it needs to be reanalyzed. It needs to be changed. So this flexibility part that we talk about, you know, if the giraffes aren't doing what you think they're going to do, then you need to change the hypothesis that you have. You need to be flexible in identifying what's going on, what's changing, and that kind of thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, different kinds of naturalistic observation. But like I said, if you're interested in this, I really like the Hells Angels book. It's really probably like a guy's book. This In Search of Respect is really interesting. So this is participant observation. And I think this was in New York City, but this Philippe Bourgeois, he actually made friends with a bunch of crack dealers in New York and, you know, just hung out with them, and he became friends with them. And I don't know if he actually like used or anything. I don't remember if he did or not. But it's really interesting because he gets these crack dealers to really just open up to him and, say on the one side how like money driven and manipulative they are, but then it also sheds them in the light of, like they are living in constant poverty themselves and they're trying to come up with a way to, bring themselves out of that, bring their families out of it. I don't think there was any like ethical issues. I think at a certain point he actually had to leave because it was either getting too violent or somebody, like the drug use was too much. I read this in a anthropology class in undergraduate, but it's really good, really interesting to read. Now we've talked about naturalistic observation, and this happens in its natural setting. You have to be flexible. Systematic observation is still using that observational tool. We're not doing surveys quite yet, but we're focusing on very specific things. So this is, let's say, 10 generations prior to the first giraffe study. Now we have, a young gun like myself that wants to make a name in giraffe research. So what I'm going to have to do is focus on something very specific. So maybe I want to focus only on like giraffe mating behavior in the dry season in another context. So it has to be very specific. And because I'm only focused on that one type of behavior, I can actually quantify the behavior at this point and only look at variation in that specific behavior. So this is used to test hypotheses. So let's say that we've already determined that giraffes frolic more when they're in the springtime, when there's a lot of greenery in the leaves and that kind of thing. So what I would want to do is like test a hypothesis. If it's a dry season, there's less frolicking or something like that. So I would go and observe the giraffes around that specific behavior of frolicking. I don't know how we'd operationalize frolic. That would be fun, I guess. It's a fun idea. But what we would do is we would operationalize that, So I think that's a good way to think about it. We'd actually come up with a way to quantify that. So we'd use a coding system, and we would have a way to identify when giraffes were frolicking and when they weren't. So this happens quite often in research of young children. So I guess I wasn't part of it, but my professors were. They were looking at how preschoolers interact with one another. So they put tracking devices on these preschoolers, and it would give them a number about how close they were to all the other preschoolers. So it was tracking social network data. But at the same time, there were trained individuals actually coding these participants and looking at the preschoolers and seeing if they played with student A, student B. Did they make eye contact? Did they fight? Did they do all of these things? So they looked at them, and on top of this social network data, they actually tried to put more kind of subjective data. So this is how the preschoolers interacted and what they were acting like. But then there was also a more quantitative part of how close they were to one another and the social network kind of thing. Our book talks about the coding system used here for social behavior of young children. Were they either unoccupied, playing by themselves? Were they playing together? Were they playing in parallel, or were they playing as a group? So they went to these kind of preschools and daycare centers and coded the behavior only in one of these categories. So they pretty much captured all of the possible ways preschoolers and these kids could interact, and then they coded them, and then whenever the kids were acting in one of those groups, they'd code them as such. So in contrast to naturalistic observation, the systematic observation focuses on one behavior. So really, it narrows it down. To be more systematic, to have more accurate observations, you need to take more issues into consideration. One is you need to be precise in measuring whatever you're doing. So you need to have usually video and voice recording equipment. So especially in case you didn't observe the interaction between students and it was maybe a trained undergraduate coder or a teaching assistant, what you'd want to do as the researcher yourself is to verify that. So you want everything video recorded as much as possible so you can go back and verify that everybody's coding was the same, so you'd have that inter-rater reliability. The reactivity is still a problem, so if you're around these students and they see you, maybe they're going to behave differently because they want to look cool or they are embarrassed or something like that. So the reactivity is a problem. And then the reliability. We need to make sure that everybody that's doing these observations and doing systematic coding of observations is seeing the same thing. So we need to make sure that interviewer A is seeing the same thing in terms of these kids' interactions as interviewer B, interviewer C, and that kind of thing. So we want to assess inter-rater reliability. Another thing is the time frame around what we're observing. So it's been found that looking at multiple snapshots over time provides to be more accurate than sitting there for one 8-hour span and watching preschoolers play. So instead of just looking at how preschoolers play on a Monday, they're all tired after the weekend, you'd probably want to, and let's say we have 8 hours to do the study. Instead of just looking at Monday, we'd probably want to look at an hour for 8 days in a row. Or we'd probably even better want to look at 20-minute segments for, what would it be, 46 or 48 different days. So you get a better representation of what's going on in the natural environment over time. So you're looking at that variation, not related to underlying things that could be those third variables at play. Sampling, something we'll talk quite a bit more about in the next chapter. Case studies. This is another kind of observational qualitative study. This focuses usually on one individual. Do you guys have a bug over there? No judgment, Maybe it came from your backpack. So these can be really interesting because they're actually focusing on one person. So instead of looking at a group of preschoolers, this would focus on one preschooler. And it would be not so helpful if you just focused on one preschooler that was average, just the everyday preschooler. That could be kind of interesting, what's the average preschooler like? But in the context of your study about like social relationships, you probably want to find the preschooler that's like that acts the weirdest, that's the leader of the group, the one that's the most unique and unique in relation to what you're interested in, and focus on them. So focus on that one participant and observe them and see what they do in their everyday lives. I don't know, as a lot of you haven't taken other psychology courses, if you've ever heard of Phineas Gage, but he was the guy, I think it was in the late 1800s, that he had a railroad spike shot through his head because they were doing dynamite, and he was out of the way, but he got a railroad spike shot through his head, and it killed a certain part of his brain that's used for I guess self-control somewhat. So he was actually still a functioning individual, even with half. I think his brain was severed down the median. And what happened was that he was generally a normal person, but he would lash out at people and he'd curse people out and was much more angry and just all over the place afterwards. And he's been used in a lot of studies to talk about how certain portions of the brain control different kinds of behaviors, and I think that was really the big thing, is that was one of the earliest examples of them knowing that we have regions in the brain that control different things. So he was a case study because he really was the first person that was displayed or where that was shown. I'm not going to show this example because we kind of are a little bit stressed for time, but this Old Spice response campaign is the YouTube video link that you're welcome to watch at home if you're interested. But what it is a case study of a certain marketing campaign. So it's actually not focused on an individual. It's focused on a specific campaign. So you've probably seen those Old Spice ads. I don't really even know how to describe them. They're just crazy. over the past 2 or 3 years, their new marketing campaign, and it got really popular. But what it does is it talks about how that campaign started from just like these, crazy young writers coming up with ideas to it becoming like a viral marketing success and just exploding and being really popular. So it's not just focused on people, living things. You can do a case study on an event. You can do a case study on maybe a certain kind of like student council event here on school, or you could probably do a case study of, I don't know, a food truck at a festival or something. It has to be focused on one thing, but it doesn't have to be it doesn't need to be psychology. It doesn't need to be focused on individuals. So, like I said, this is where we focus on interesting things that are rare, so I wouldn't want to just focus on the cheap falafel food cart at the festival. I'd probably want to focus on the one that has been extremely successful. They come up with really crazy recipes. They're on diners, drive-ins, and drive-throughs. 3D, that's something like that. So, they need to be noteworthy. Now we're kind of changing. So now we've been under the assumption that we're collecting this data, or an individual is collecting this data. So now we're looking at really data that somebody else has collected. So this is archival research. We call it secondary data analysis. I'm using somebody else's information and drawing new conclusions from that. So this can be all sorts of different sources of data. It's a little bit hard for me even to draw the line between what we've been talking about in qualitative research and looking at this, because this becomes definitely more quantitative, especially when we start talking about the 3 types of archival research and statistical records. So this is really what I do for my research, is I go and take somebody else's statistical records and analyze them anew. So let's say I'm interested in low birth weight births to teen moms, and I think that Texas, because of new legislation and that kind of thing, maybe is increasing for whatever reason in Texas, there's increasing low birth weights amongst teen mothers. What I could do to test that hypothesis is actually go find the rates of low birth weight births to teen mothers here, and then I could go and compare it to that same low birth weight births among teen moms in Arizona or Colorado, all over the United States, because everybody's collecting that same information. We have standardized birth certificates now. So I can go and pull all of that different data together and do the analysis myself. It's a lot different than the naturalistic observation, even the systematic observation we've talked about. So I think it is a little bit hard to turn the corner to this. And if I was to write this book, I don't know if I would write this in this chapter, because I think it doesn't fit very well. So we have these 3 types of archival research. We have statistical records, and this is things like the Census Bureau, crime data, pretty much data you can go and pull off the internet super easy. We also have survey archives. So General Social Survey is a really big representative sample of the United States, and they ask really basic questions, and they also ask very specific questions. I use this in my graduate statistics course because it's readily available. I think I have data for 2014 already, but it's pretty interesting. The Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, or Surveillance System, that's what I've talked about as the BRFIS. So this is a survey archive where you can go on our state's BRFIS website and pull data from their BRFIS collection and analyze it for yourself. Then there's also these written records and mass communication records. So a lot of people that I don't know if you guys have been exposed to what big data analysis is, and they call them what do they call them? Not research scientists now, data scientists. So especially in Austin, where there's a lot of tech companies now, people are data scientists instead of statisticians. What these people do is they analyze just huge, really complex, unstructured data. So they could go onto, let's say, Facebook. Facebook is in Austin. So there's probably a data scientist that works there at Facebook that goes and sifts through all of the posts. So let's say that there's an event. What's a current event going on? So NBA Finals, that's a fun one. There's also the NAACP leader that was acting, or she misidentified herself as black. So both of those things are trending right now. So maybe Facebook wants to see why certain, what are the characteristics of people that are posting these kinds of things. So the data scientist would go and write some kind of program that only pulls information from people's accounts that have posted or like maybe reposted one of these things over the past 10 days. And then they would have all of these people and all of the ways that they talked about these different things. So they would actually reduce all of the textual data, all of the sentences, everything that anybody's written into these themes, and they'd have these thematic patterns of, we're seeing a lot more people maybe that are living in Cleveland and California talking about the NBA Finals than elsewhere. I think more interesting is the NAACP example. What are the characteristics of the people that are pro, like she should continue as the NAACP director of Spokane, Washington, versus those that are really against her, and kind of seeing, maybe what are the characteristics of their friends and that kind of thing. And that's something a data scientist would do, that if I ever get fired from here, that's where you'll find me, because they make a lot of money. Not necessarily have a lot of fun, but they make a lot of money.
What race is she?
She's white. Her parents actually called her out. Her parents,
How do you
her
talk
parent.
about something like that? Is she very like tan looking or?
No. Well, she looks like she fake tans. But there's pictures of her in like adolescence, and she's really totally Caucasian.
She permed her hair, like really, really tight curls.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, and I don't really know where I fall on it. It's quite interesting. So there's a lot of that, at least on my Facebook feeds, because I have a lot of friends who are professors of race and ethnicity and sociology, so they all have strong opinions on it and that kind of thing. But this is an archive. So after it's been put into Facebook, all of that data becomes an archive for somebody to research. Really, like when you go to HEB, wherever you do shop, all of the data, everything that you buy from them is put into an archive. So they look at your shopping habits, and you probably get the coupons at the end specific to what you've purchased, regularly over the past couple months. So that's part of a, data science program that's probably predicting what you're going to buy next. And they probably also they probably do all sorts of kinds of observations, and I won't go into it much more. But this is really, this is, I think, the really interesting stuff. So survey archives and statistical records is really where I've kind of drawn my career around. I've actually done some textual analysis. So for working for the Arizona Department of Health Services, I was doing, and this was just on my free time, learning how to do some data science stuff. But we had a medical marijuana program there, and we actually administered medical marijuana. So I just wanted to see like how many blog posts are direct or made about medical marijuana, and so I wrote a program so I wrote a statistical program in a language called Python, and what it did was it went through our blog and pulled any mention of medical marijuana, gave me the date and time for that. It really wasn't something that was useful. It was just me training. But that was kind of a way of me bringing in this idea of I want to use communication research because I think it's interesting. And it's really important now. I described to you, I think it was Thursday or Friday, of my study of not libraries, of kitchens on cooking, different kinds of cooking shows. So looking at PBS versus Food Network and seeing how kitchens were gendered. What we were doing was we were doing a content analysis. We were analyzing the content of these TV shows. So we were analyzing these documents that I made. We were pretty much, you could take the show as a document itself. I videotaped those, and so we had those to analyze. And then what I did was I created a systematic way to observe these different documents. So I said, okay, is the person wearing an apron, like a chef's apron or a home apron? Are they cooking on a stainless steel stove? Or are they cooking on like an old school, cool, I don't know, teal 1950s stove or whatever? And I systematically observed everything in that kitchen. So what I was doing was content analysis. You can really get at different, so that was something that nobody had studied at the time. It never got published. We never made anything of it. But nobody had addressed that before. Is there differences in these kinds of cooking shows? So it's something that's really, it's a really good tool for you to come up with new ideas and new research questions. So it's something that gives you the ability to quantify something that nobody has done before. So if you were just interested in, let's say, I don't know, the impact of certain kinds of language in the Cosmopolitan magazine on self-image in younger girls, what you could do is get Cosmo over the last year, and then hopefully you have it online so you can use a computer to do this. But if not, you go through and read every page, and then say that there's certain statements or there's certain kinds of ways women are portrayed that you think has a negative impact on young girls. And every time that statement was mentioned, every time maybe that's, I don't know, photo or that situation was presented, you'd make note of it. And then over all of that time, over the year, you would see how many times it was mentioned, what context it was mentioned. And then you could actually make a statement about how much does Cosmo show these kinds of issues or present these kinds of settings to young women. And I bring this up because I find it hilarious that HEB has Cosmo on like their shelves, but they have this sort of morality jacket around it. So, because all it talks about is sex on the front page, and they continue to put it on the shelves, like in the front in checkout, but they have the thing like it's almost like a pornographic magazine. They're blocking all of it. I just find it hilarious. I've never seen that before. So, the last couple of times I've been at HEB, I've noticed it, and it's crazy. Anyway, content analysis takes a lot of time. So, you have to have 2 or 3 individuals looking at the same thing over and over. It can become really difficult. And it's hard to make sure that it's accurate. So if I'm doing this Cosmo thing, and I'm the only one that's really interested in looking at how women are portrayed related to this certain maybe topic, it's going to be hard for me to make sense of that, especially to anybody else, because maybe they have different understandings of what these kind of key terms are, and I didn't specify that to them. So if I gave you a stack of Cosmos and said, okay, read through this and tell me what you think about how it represents, I don't know, sex amongst teen moms and that kind of thing, you might get a whole different perspective on it. So unless I make sure that the coding is systematic, that we have all been trained to observe the same thing, that we do inter-rater reliability to make sure that we're seeing the same thing, it's hard to make accurate. So there's a lot of steps that need to be done to ensure accuracy of this kind of research.